Voters head to the polls for the first off-year election since Donald Trump returned to office. What is the mood in New Jersey, Virginia, New York, and California? And what do these races mean for the U.S. political scene going forward?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, and joining us this week is one of my favorite people to read for his very astute political analysis, Noah Rothman, senior writer for National Review. Noah, thanks for allowing us to put you on the spot on the day of election so we can force you to make predictions and then hold you to them.
That's dangerous territory. I did not know what you were roping me into here, Kim. Bait and switch.
We pull you in.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege.
Yeah. Before we jump into some of these individual races, I just want to step back for a second. So political commentators tend to place a lot of emphasis on these off-year elections, especially in the first year after you get a new president in the White House, as something that is supposedly telling us something profound about the mood in the country. I think that there's an element of that which is totally correct. Although in some ways, I also find the ritual just a little bit bizarre because in reality, it's two states, Virginia and New Jersey, which have some of their own unusual politics, not necessarily representative of a lot of other states. So I guess my question is, what do you think the outcomes of these races will actually say about the state of the nation?
Well, I think you're right. I think partisans, in particular, the party out of power and those who are attracted to its politics, put a lot more emphasis on these because it's the first contest after the last one you just lost. And you want to gauge some level of intensity on your side. And typically, the party out of power does really well in off-year elections in, as you said, New Jersey and Virginia, but also the New York City mayorship. And in Pennsylvania, there's some offices, there's some court offices. So there are opportunities to test the waters in some swingish states in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, maybe in Virginia, sort of purple. But by and large, they have not reflected what the results are going to be, for example, in the midterms, not especially well. And they certainly don't say anything about the subsequent presidential election 3 years hence. So they can be overstated pretty significantly. However, they do give you some indication of where voters are in enthusiasm and intensity. And so you can see whose voters are coming out and who aren't. And that can give you some tea leaves to read about how the politics of the next year are going to shape up. But they're often overstated in the amount of in what they say about where the electorate is headed nationally. There's a couple of things I think you can glean from these races, especially when you have an atypical result, like, for example, in 2009, the loss of John Corzine, New Jersey governor, to Chris Christie. That set up a political career that was going to have a national impact. And in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin was also indicative of sort of a shift in the politics of the Mid-Atlantic. But I think it's really easy to say that these things have much more predictive power about the future evolution of American politics than they tend to.
Yeah, I agree with you on the ground statistics. One thing I want to look at is you've heard a lot of Republicans saying, oh, our secret hidden strength is all of the people we've signed up over the last 4 years in Virginia and New Jersey. We'll see how many of them actually show up in the end. I think to your point about enthusiasm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that I am going to be looking very closely for. In 2021, for example, Jack Ciattarelli, who's running this year, ran very close, outperformed his polls, didn't get the brass ring, but he got to within about 3 points. But he did so in part because a lot of Democratic constituencies didn't show up. Hispanics, African Americans, younger voters just really didn't turn out in 2021. They did in 2024. But with the exception of young voters, a lot of minorities in New Jersey, African Americans and Hispanics in particular, voted Republican. Right. I'm very curious to see if we see the continuation of that trend or if that was a 2024 phenomenon just because Donald Trump was out of power and now that he has a record, they're a little bit less enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, it's a great point. I also saw a story saying Democrats were gleeful in New Jersey because they'd hit their magic number of their votes come back in early voting, but you don't know how those people are voting. So it's it's kind of an unknown there. You just brought up another big question I wanted to ask again before we get into these individual races, because it hasn't been getting a lot of attention, but I think it's very salient, and that is the polls. The commentariat is once again running around taking all these polls as gospel. The Real Clear Politics average has Abigail Spanberger up 9 points over Winsome Earle-Sears. In New Jersey, Mikey Sherrill, the Democrat, up 3.3 points over Jack Ciattarelli. But I remember 4 years ago, and you just mentioned this, going into election night, Ciattarelli, there were polls that had him down 10, 11, 12 points. And even the Real Clear Politics average had him down 8. He only lost by 3. We also know that the polls last November, they were still way off in some swing states where they were off in terms of the Trump-Kamala vote by anywhere from 2 to 8 points. So how realistic do you actually think these polls are right now in terms of the state of the race?
Look, I don't know, and I'm following them all very closely, especially in my state, in New Jersey. I will confess that I'm not following Virginia as closely as I am the New York City mayor race and New Jersey. It's a parochial bias on my part. I happen to live here. But, you can say the critique of the polls is perennial, is that when you're using a likely voter screen, you're modeling the electorate. You don't actually know what the electorate's going to look like. You're just kind of testing based on enthusiasm and propensity to vote, and can be a flawed model. But if you're just sampling registered voters, just the only barrier to entry there is, are you registered to vote, self-reported? You should get a cleaner view of what the actual electorate looks like. Whether they show up at the polls is another matter, but that's what general sentiment is. But even that's been missing, especially since the pandemic. And I don't know whether or not the pandemic era response rate problems persist, just the difficulty of getting high propensity voters on the phone or to respond to an online survey was prohibitive. And I don't know if those have been resolved. They weren't really resolved in 2024. So you should take all the polling that you're seeing with a grain of salt. All of them are modeling an electorate, and all of them look wildly different. I'm looking at the suite of polling that we've had over the last week in New Jersey alone, and it's a Sherrill rather +1, +1, +3, +7, +4, +2, +7, +1. Take your pick. It's all over the map. And if it's a +1 race or a +2 race, you have every reason to expect that this has missed a lot of Republican voters who are mistrustful of pollsters or media outlets, don't respond to them, but do vote. That has been the story of American politics for the last 5 years. So if it's a close race, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Republicans aren't being well sampled and that they will show up at the polls.
Something to watch really closely. I'm just curious. It's sort of a side issue, but we still have a lot of polling problems, and it just doesn't seem to get any better any cycle. I promise we will come back to New Jersey, your home state, but let's look at Virginia real quick.
Sure.
Because in part I find this one of the tougher races to read, not necessarily in terms of who they're saying is up and down, but in terms of the dynamics of it. And part of it is because it's this really messy situation. It's been rocked by these scandals down ballot. Most recently this texting scandal over the Democratic Attorney General nominee, Jay Jones. But prior to that, a different scandal over the GOP nominee for Lieutenant Governor, John Reed, and these lewd postings to this social media account that he claims are not his, but Democrats say are. It's really muddied things at the gubernatorial level in a certain way. And the whole campaign just feels a bit muddy to me. Glenn Youngkin, if you think about it, he wins this victory 4 years ago in a state that had become tough for the GOP to win, and did it by running on these like kitchen table affordability issues, cost of living, bring business to the states, give parents some more control over their schooling. He's done a pretty solid job on that front. And you would think that would be what Sears would really be building on. She instead seems to be appealing very much to the base, rallying them on cultural issues to try to get turnout, not so much on jobs and affordability. I mean, some, but it's not her hallmark. Spanberger, meanwhile, is not talking about Virginia so much as Donald Trump and the shutdown and how she needs to stand up against him. I mean, is anybody talking to everyday Virginians in this race?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think you've pegged it pretty well. Both campaigns are appealing to their respective base voters. They think it's a base election. Both Spanberger and Sherrill have tried to nationalize the race and say that this is essentially a referendum on Donald Trump's time in office. It's not really, it's not about me, really. It's about the movement, right? And Winsome Sears, to the extent that I have seen her ads, and again, I'm not in Virginia, so I'm not privy to every spot that they're running, but the ones that have made national traction and which Sears' campaign themselves are promoting pretty aggressively are the transgender spots, the spots on transgender access to single gender bathrooms and Spanberger's non-response when it comes to violence that's committed by those who are attracted to trans lifestyles. And I don't see that working for her. I mean, the polling is pretty clear in Virginia. This is not really a competitive race from what we're seeing in the numbers. And you'll go back to 2021 when Glenn Youngkin won. He won by just under 2 points. It was not a resounding victory. He squeaked it out. And he did so, as you say, by appealing to these kitchen table issues with cross-partisan appeal. And he had the advantage of Joe Biden being in the White House and Republicans being enthusiastic for off-year elections. So all of that was working in Glenn Youngkin's favor. I don't know if it's duplicable. I don't know if Winsome Earle-Sears could overcome some of these headwinds, even if she was a candidate who is less inclined to mobilize the base to the exclusion of persuadable voters. That's kind of what I see from her campaign. It's not as though transgender issues and transgenderism as a violent menace and a threat to your liberty doesn't have a broad constituency, a cross-partisan appeal. It certainly does. But as I see her ads being framed, it is Democrats are on the wrong side of this issue, which isn't necessarily going to appeal to, especially in places like Alexandria, right across the river, where it's all Democratic and it's all attached to the federal workforce. Those are going to be persuadable voters if you can appeal to them on family matters, for example, like the safety of your family. They're not going to appeal if you're saying the Democratic Party writ large is on the wrong side of this cultural issue. That just induces sort of a partisan, tribal, rally around the flag kind of thing. And I think that's what they're going for. I think she thinks that her pathway to victory is through mobilizing Republican voters and depressing, importantly, Democratic voters.
Well, the other thing that seems to be missing there, and you were talking about headwinds, is like, count me as a person who is not at all surprised that this shutdown is still going on in government, because I think Democrats wanted it to last through Election Day, because they've got a lot of these Democratic leaning federal workers who are out of work at the moment and blaming Donald Trump. And, those are the voters Sears needs to win. And by not talking about affordability and addressing this issue head on, I think that is actually really working against her in the end too.
That's fascinating, Kim. So do you think that the takeaway that they'll talk themselves into, if this succeeds, as they say, let's say they sweep all the races today and they congratulate themselves on a successful shutdown strategy and then declare victory and retreat. The conclusion that they'll draw then is that this obstructionism was brilliant, worked out for them. The pain that they imposed on their own voters was worth it. I see them, if that's the takeaway from it, and then they're inclined to do this whole thing again, I feel like they're going to be setting themselves up for failure. But who am I to say? I mean, there's an argument to be made that this extremely cynical strategy that they've adopted did succeed from their perspective on those terms.
Well, they certainly think it is. And I want to get to that question about the Democratic Party. But first, your home state, New Jersey. I find this one an easier race to get my head around. Not so much the scandal so much, but the issues seem to me clearer. Ciattarelli is going straight at the cost of living in New Jersey. High taxes, high property taxes. Phil Murphy's climate agenda, which has driven up energy costs, hitting Mikey, actually the opposite of Winsome Earle-Sears. And you pointed this out in a column you did. He's going after Democrats, claiming they're the ones that care too much about cultural issues. Like, for instance, focusing more on pronouns than about, your bills as a New Jersey person. So she's also talking about affordability, but it's kind of hard for her because her party's been in charge. It's hard for a Republican to win in New Jersey, but do you think there's a shot here?
I do think there's a shot. I don't know if I would give it much more than that. It's an outside potential. The polling doesn't suggest that he's in the pole position. Again, there hasn't been a single poll that I've been privy to that shows Jack Ciattarelli winning this race, merely getting very, very close. And you have to spot him a couple points, which is not necessarily unreasonable, as we talked about. But it is nevertheless conjecture on all our parts to do that when we don't have the data sitting in front of us. What I haven't seen in the polls are indications that the voting public is as put off and really resentful of the extremely quick rise of utility costs in this state. Electricity costs skyrocketed over the summer. I was one of the many New Jerseyans who experienced a power bill that was 3 times larger than any I'd ever gotten, including regular meter reads. Yeah, it just happened overnight. And it's really uncomfortable, and a lot of people resent it. But you don't see it as much in the polling of top issues, right? The top issue is the cost of taxes, by which I think they mean, because it's usually just lumped in, property taxes, but also sales and income taxes, but probably mostly property taxes. But I see the Ciattarelli campaign really leaning heavily on the utilities message, and in particular leveraging it for, as you say, to jab at the Murphy administration for this debacle of a wind farm proposal that never reached fruition for a variety of complicated reasons, but the bottom line being that Trenton just mucked it all up. And it has a reciprocal effect on rising rates of electricity, in particular, given the use that data centers are driving up during these periods of high use. And Mikey Sherrill's, this might be a very conservative complaint, but Mikey Sherrill's proposal just is nonsensical. Like, her plan to deal with this is to declare a statewide emergency and to freeze prices, and then to persuade power companies to put off raising prices until the winter, when it's just a lot less likely to notice it because fewer people using power. This to me is so duplicitous. It's just such dumb policy, but I don't know if that resonates beyond my ideological cohort. I do think that her other message, which is that Jack Ciattarelli is a tax hiker, that she's the one who's coming after your property taxes, your sales taxes, your income taxes, that she's going to get you relief, unlike the Republican in this race who's just desperate to rip money out of your wallet. This also, to me, just doesn't seem, it seems to be something that you would have to be an extremely partisan Democrat for you to actually wrap your head around, much less, adopt yourself the notion that Republicans are just, big taxers and big spenders. It doesn't really fit with Jack Ciattarelli's record, but it doesn't seem to have necessarily been rejected by voters either. If you look at his popularity, rather his fave on faves, he's consistently trails Mikey Sherrill. And when you ask him what her plan is for taxes, her plan for power, New Jersey voters say they like Sherrill. Now, maybe that's just a partisan Democratic response, and these voters haven't put a whole lot of thought into it. But maybe they have. Maybe they do like these kind of policies, and they're compartmentalizing all of it just so they can send a message to Washington that's, I'm very apprehensive about Donald Trump being in the White House. All of those could all be. There's not necessarily mutually exclusive. All of them could be working together to conspire on her behalf. But I don't know. His policies to me are much more well articulated than hers. She is like her counterpart in Virginia, touching a lot of cultural buttons and saying, listen, whose side are you on when it comes to Trump?
Well, that raises a question, though. I mean, he seems to be running a pretty focused campaign. If New Jersey is not ripe for some sort of property tax revolt in general, an energy revolt now, when will it ever be? I mean, I guess the question is there something missing? If he comes up short here and he loses, is there something that's been missing from his campaign, or is it simply that it's impossible for a Republican to win in New Jersey, in particular now with Donald Trump in the White House?
I think he's run a very good race. I'm reluctant to criticize his approach to campaigning because I've found it to be a perfect fit for his state and in this moment, and it's reflected in the polls. This is a reach state for any Republican. The fact that it is this competitive is attributable both to the Ciattarelli campaign's competence. They've done this once already, and they did pretty well the last time around, and they're running very smart, well-defined themes tailored to their specific audience, not falling into the traps that the Sherrill campaign has set for them, and which Republicans on the national stage might like him to fall into if he were to embrace Donald Trump with too much vigor. That would not help him to win this state, and they've been very cautious about that in a smart way. And I would also say that there's a significant amount of tailwinds for the Ciattarelli campaign that will advantage him at the polls today. Democrats have not managed to retain the governorship for 3 consecutive terms since 1961. Phil Murphy is the outgoing incumbent governor, is the first Democrat to serve 2 full terms since Brendan Byrne in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Democrats have a tendency to be scandaled out of office or removed by the voters. So there is Democrat fatigue in this state. But as you said, typically in an off-year election, the party out of power, especially in an off-year election right after the general, the party out of power has a tendency to do better because their partisan voters are much more enthusiastic, much more energized, and much more desperate and hungry for evidence of their own political efficacy. And this is the only game in town. So, and Democrats love voting. It is one thing they just get out of bed to do in the morning. They do not miss an opportunity to vote. I find it hard to believe that Democrats could miss these contests. But if they did in New Jersey, it would be quite the earthquake.
Well, that perfectly sets up a last question I want to ask you, which takes us to the last kind of big race going on out there. Obviously, the New York mayoral race. And my own view is, barring a meteorite hitting New York City, nothing is going to stop Zohran Mamdani from winning this race. And it's also, to me, pretty clear to most people who are looking at this what went wrong here. Terrifically flawed candidates in Andrew Cuomo and Eric Adams, people staying in too long. There's this contrast between old and young. But I want your thoughts on what this says about the Democratic Party going forward, just to kind of round back to something you mentioned earlier. They got shellacked last year, and you had begun to see this party acknowledging that it maybe needed to step back and tone down the Bernie Sanders direction. Now they've got this full-on socialist winning in New York. The left is already presenting this as proof that this is the correct direction forward. We need to double down. I even have seen some on that side of the Democratic Party saying, look, hey, you can see the contrast right there. The party decided to run 2 moderates in New Jersey and Virginia, and Mikey Sherrill's barely winning in the polls, whereas Mamdani is cruising to victory. Why wouldn't we just go ahead with the AOC model? Forget what Donald Trump or Republicans might take from this victory. What do you think Democrats take from this victory, and what does it mean to the future of their party?
Well, progressives are going to say that about moderate Democrats who lose elections because they've been saying that forever, and it hasn't really had a lot of purchase outside progressives. Bernie Sanders lost in 2016, and they've been retailing this narrative ever since for a decade. And it really resonates with progressive voters who are already converted to the cause, but I haven't seen a ton of evidence that it is converting otherwise moderate Democrats or establishmentarian Democrats who are the gatekeepers of this sort of thing. That doesn't mean they're not going to keep retailing the argument. They will continue to do so. And as you say, and I think you're right, that it's kind of unlikely to me that Mamdani would have emerged the winner of the Democratic primary, if we had an incumbent mayor who was seeking re-election, who wasn't horribly corrupt and had not been pardoned by the Republican president, who's deeply unpopular in New York City, and B, a disgraced governor who's still trying to slough off the scandals that hang about him. The odor that is just around the Cuomo campaign is suffocating. And it's not something that New Yorkers could stomach. In the absence of this historic confluence of events, you probably wouldn't have had this socialist ascension. But his victory today, and I think it is all but assured, is going to be the high watermark of the popularity of this guy. The second he has to hit the ground and try to make manifest his many political proposals, all of which hinge on Albany, which, by the way, is controlled by an endorser in Kathy Hochul, but someone who is very steadfast in her opposition to raising taxes, either income or corporate taxes, in order to pay for Mamdani's utopian schemes. So he's going to go to war with her. She's going to have to defend himself against him somehow. She's so maladroit that I expect she'll lose whatever contest she starts with him, but she will nevertheless have to contest it. And then there's the X factor in New Jersey, right? So you can tell the press really does want to give Mamdani the Obama treatment. They've been testing the waters recently. They'd like to make him a light worker. But if New Jersey goes the other direction, the narrative that they will not be able to avoid and that Democrats will internalize instantly, because as you said, they've already internalized it after 2024, is that this stuff is poison in the suburbs and we will be a minority party permanently if we endorse it. So I'm kind of hoping for that outcome.
I hadn't thought about it. I mean, this is a bleed over from New York to New
Yep.
Jersey, and people are seeing this race and internalizing it as much as they are their race in their home state. Well, Noah Rothman, we thank you so much for coming in, for imparting all of your brilliance. We'll look excitedly forward to today to see how things turn out. We want to thank our listeners. If you like the show, please do hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at atkim@wsj.com.